Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Books and Books. Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida. So for those of you watching on the internet at home, if at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, you can just call the number on your screen. We will get it signed for you, and we will ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome back Dr. Carl Hart, presenting the softcover release of his acclaimed book, High Price, a Neuroscientist's Journey of Self-Discovery that challenges everything you know about drugs and society. Dr. Hart is a Miami native now living in New York City, where he is an associate professor in the departments of psychology and psychiatry at Columbia University. He is also a research scientist in the Division of Substance Abuse at the New York State Psychiatric Institute and a member of the National Advisory Council on Drug Abuse. In this book, Dr. Hart redefines our understanding of addiction. His controversial landmark research goes beyond the hype of the anti-drug movement to shed new light on common ideas about race, poverty, and drugs, and to explain why current policies are failing. We had the pleasure of having Dr. Hart here for the hardcover release of this. He's here tonight for softcover, as I said. The book has been having a terrific impact and been getting wonderful reviews. I have something here from Kirkus Reviews that I'd like to share for you. It says, a hard-hitting attack on current drug policy by a neuroscientist who grew up on the streets of one of Miami's toughest neighborhoods. Hart debunks claims that the use of crack cocaine is more dangerous than other forms of the drug and therefore should be punished more severely, a distinction that penalizes ghetto users who are the most typical crack users. Reflecting on his experiences growing up in the ghetto, Hart realized that social environment was as important as the availability of street drugs. His own remarkable path to success included a large component of good luck. This is an eye-opening, absorbing, complex story of scientific achievement in the face of overwhelming odds. We are very happy to have him back at Books and Books. Please welcome Dr. Carl Hart.
Thank you all for coming out. That was a nice introduction to Kirkus Review. The thing about those kind of reviews, even they sometimes perpetuate myths. Like the whole thing about good luck, please don't get it twisted. It was a lot of hard work. There was just a little bit of luck. It was mostly work. The luck sort of thing allows America to avoid really putting in the effort in the people. So I just want to make sure we have that clear. It was hard work and people who put work into me as well. So the luck thing, that annoys me, even though it was a positive review. And I didn't realize I was growing up in the ghetto until I left. And so it's another one of those things that's a little annoying. But it is, you know, with this book, it's been now a year. And I have been all around the world as a result of this book in a number of countries. One of the most memorable is Brazil, because Brazil is 50% African, basically. But you wouldn't know it by looking at the World Cup and the sort of images that you see from Brazil. And they think they too have a drug problem. And so the book has been well received in those kind of places where it's really relevant. They have a similar sort of situation to what we have going on here. But all of those places that I have been, my favorite place to come back to is right here, Books and Books here in Miami. I so appreciate what Mitch is doing here in Miami in terms of the Miami Book Fair, this place. And so I am delighted that you all came out tonight. And so I hope that I give you all a treat. I'm going to talk about something a little different from what I did last time. Last time it was really focused on the book. I'm going to use a lot of the same facts from the book, but I'm going to try and build a different sort of story with those facts. And the story that I'm going to deal with today deals with counterintuitive thinking. If any of you all are interested in publishing a book, you all read books, publishers and those sorts of folks, they are always asking you about what the counterintuitive idea is. because that's what sells, the sort of counterintuitive point, fact, idea, belief. Those are the things that sell. And so that's what this talk will deal with primarily, sort of counterintuitive thinking that challenges what we all think we know about race, drugs, and our society, and poverty. Okay, that's the book you all know. In order to accomplish this goal, one of the things that I need you all to do for me is to come back with me, if you will, to the mid to late 1980s. So some of you, well, most of you all look like you've been there. So shouldn't be a stretch, right? Yeah, I'm telling you. At that time, as almost 30 years ago to the day, I was flying out of Miami International Airport headed for San Antonio, Texas for basic training. I was in the Air Force in the mid-late 1980s. But in 1986, I was over in England in the Air Force, and the big sort of concern in the United States was crack cocaine. And I was hearing these reports coming back from my neighborhood whenever I come back on leave, people telling me about this new form of crack, of cocaine, the smokable crack cocaine. And then in the summer of '86, something big happened. Len Bias, he was the second draft pick of the 1986 NBA draft. He was Boston Celtics' first draft pick. He celebrated being this high top draft pick by going out and doing some cocaine. Unfortunately, he died. At the time, the Speaker of the House was Tip O'Neill from Boston, a big Boston Celtics fan. And so that gave this sort of event an even more outsized effect. But Len Bias died, and initial reports were that he had went out and smoked crack cocaine for the first time. And this was evidence that this drug was so dangerous and unpredictable. And then, like a month later, the Cleveland Browns cornerback, Don Rogers, also about Len Bias's age, these guys were 22, 23 years old, top athletes in great shape. And the reports, initial reports, was that he also smoked cocaine, crack cocaine. Again, further evidence that this drug was so dangerous that something had to be done about it. A few months later, I don't think we have the sound for this particular clip. I'm sorry. I'm supposed to be, see, I'm moving, I should take a step back. I'm moving the slides here, but I see my slides, but you guys don't see my slides. My bad, I'm sorry. But you all are still following me, right? You all in the house, right? All right. You're in the house. You're in the house. That was the 1980. Yeah, there we go. And this was supposed to be a clip of Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan addressing the nation about this awful form of cocaine. And this was their sort of first real press conference to the nation about how dangerous this drug was. And in this press conference, Ronald Reagan kind of turned it over to Nancy, saying that she had been interested in drugs for some time, and this would be her sort of raison d'etre, if you will. This was her reason for being. And she pointed out that the country, the nation, should be inflexible and intolerant to drug users. So those were the kind of words that she was using to talk about crack cocaine. If you think, and you all look like you all have children, and if you have children and you try and educate your kids, the words inflexible and intolerant should be used rarely, right? Because flexibility, for example, cognitive flexibility, for example, is one of the hallmarks of human intelligence. And so when you use words like being inflexible, that's not really good for critical thinking. But this was the kind of language that we saw when it came to crack cocaine. And we were so concerned in the country that we passed, Ronald Reagan declared, October 1986 Crack Cocaine Awareness Month. There was a proclamation. So whenever the country gets really concerned about something, presidents issue these proclamations. And that's what happened. And so this was to show that the country was really serious about crack cocaine, or the concern about crack cocaine. Also evidence that we were really serious about crack cocaine came from unlikely sources. The Ku Klux Klan and the NAACP, they teamed up. Now, if any of you all know anything about the Klan, their mission is white supremacy, and that's kind of inconsistent with the NAACP's mission. But crack cocaine was seen as such a serious problem that these two organizations teamed up to get rid of crack cocaine just north in Lackland, Florida. So the Klan said they would get these crack dealers off the streets, and they had essentially the blessing of the NAACP. This is how serious the country thought this problem was. Now, I hope some of you all are like, that's messed up. I hope some of you all are saying that, right? Also, we saw this in our movies. We saw movies like New Jack Cities. We saw other movies. We saw this in our art. How dangerous and how awful crack cocaine was. The country was uniform in its disapproval of crack cocaine. As a result, Congress had to act. Congress acted the only way they knew how. They passed new legislation in 1986 and extended this legislation in 1988. But this legislation is the now infamous 100-to-1, where we punish crack cocaine 100 times more harshly. We punish crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine, meaning that a small amount of crack cocaine will get you a mandatory minimum sentence in prison, 5 years, 10 years or so. These laws were passed in that sort of environment. And you know, it seemed like the right thing to do. As we look back now, I said it's the now infamous laws. There are reasons that we say it's the now infamous laws. I'll get to them. But I just want to say, when it came to these laws, it had bipartisan support. So it's not a Democrat-Republican thing. In fact, 16 of the 20 Congressional Black Caucus members voted for this legislation. So it was across the aisle support of these laws. And I was about the same time getting out of the Air Force in 1988. And I was thinking, well, how can I help? How can I contribute to this, to solve this problem? I thought, for example, that crack cocaine, that's me back in the day, by the way, I thought that crack cocaine was so dangerous and so addictive that it was the major problem in poor communities like the one from which I came. So I thought that if we solved the crack cocaine addiction problem, we could solve poverty and we could solve crime. So I decided to pursue a PhD in neuroscience so I could understand the neurobiological mechanisms responsible for drug addictions. And that's what I did. I pursued neuroscience and a PhD to understand these mechanisms. So we have now, if you are with me, we have an environment now where it seems as though there is uniform agreement in terms of the dangers of crack, in terms of our response to crack cocaine. Uniform agreement in our society. Whenever you have uniform agreement like this, Congress agrees, the President agrees, law enforcement agrees, all of these people agreeing, that is a perfect situation for counterintuitive thinking. Everybody agrees. If you are agreeing with Congress, if you agree with the President on many of these issues, you're probably wrong. But this is important for us to think about how we can do counterintuitive thinking. Why is counterintuitive thinking so important? Well, it is the stuff of which scientific breakthroughs are made of. It is also the stuff of great stories. And it's the stuff that publishers want. So counterintuitive thinking is critically important for us to understand how to do or think about in this society. Now, when we say, well, we'll set out to think about something counterintuitively, that's a difficult task. But so just hang on to that. So I'm not going to ask you to do that difficult of a task, but just hang on to that for me, if you would. But back to me. I went on studying my PhD to get my PhD in neuroscience. And one of the things that happens when you go and get an education is this, as James Baldwin said. The paradox of education is precisely this. That as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he's being educated. And that happened to me. I actually got an education. I started to look at this society. And then when you do that sort of thing and you study drugs, one of the things that you do is you look at history. And that's what I did. I went and I looked at the sort of what people had said 100 years before the crack cocaine epidemic about cocaine and other drugs. What were people saying? I came across this article. This is an article published in 1914 in the New York Times, February 8th, 1914, almost 100 years ago to the day. In this article, the at the time eminent Dr. Williams pointed out that there was now these Negro cocaine fiends in the South, and they were causing these problems. The problems that they were causing, the simple idea was that there was this new form of cocaine. This form of cocaine was snorted cocaine. They were snorting this cocaine. And the problem was this. Cocaine made these black folks in the South more murderous. They were more homicidal. But what's worse is that it also made them better marksmen. So you got these folks who are more homicidal and they can shoot better. But that's not it. That's not it. They also were unaffected by .32 caliber weapon bullets. So police forces in the South moved away from the .32 caliber weapon to the .38 caliber weapon as a result of these types of stories. So as I read these kind of reports from the record of the day, the New York Times, and then I compared it to what was being said about crack cocaine in the 1980s, 1990s, it was eerily similar. Of course, the language had been tempered such that you got rid of some of the overtly racist language. So instead of, like in this article, for example, the word nigger appears. Instead of the word nigger appearing, you no longer needed to say nigger in 1986, 1988. You just said urban. You just said poor neighborhoods. We all know who we're talking about. You just said ghetto. We know who you're talking about. And so those sorts of things, the language was tempered, but really, the major points were the same. Anyway, so it got me to start thinking about our society. And about the same time, I finished my PhD, and I did a postdoc with this woman, Marion Fishman. She was my main mentor as a postdoc. When you finish your PhD, you do additional training. One of the things that Marion was really good at saying was, what do the data say? She really didn't care what I had to say, what I felt about something, my emotion. She just wanted to know what the data said. It's been the most important statement, the most important educational lesson I've learned in my life is that I ask, what do the data say? And then my position follows from whatever the data says. And so as we think about counterintuitive thinking, there's no need for you to try and figure out how can I think counterintuitively. All you have to do is follow the data, because most of the people who are talking about information don't know the data. They're not following the data. So if you follow the data, you are actually probably being counterintuitive. So that's an important point here. So as we think about the data as it relates to crack cocaine and those laws that we passed, think about the 100-to-1 ratio with crack being punished a lot more harshly. As we think about that, we have to look at this fact. Oh, it didn't show up. Didn't show up. Okay, that's fine. This slide would have showed you that from the time we implemented those laws, more than 80% of the people who were prosecuted at the federal level were black. more than 80%, even though the majority of crack cocaine users are not black. So more than 80% of the people who were getting these harsh penalties were black. In 1992, when we really started looking at the data, in LA County, for example, LA County, some of you all know, is a pretty big county and is diverse, extremely diverse. LA County in 1992, by 1992, not one white person was convicted under these laws. That's the kind of egregious findings that were found with this law. Now, other things that, well, we should take a step back, because then people say, well, Congress wasn't being racist by passing these laws. No, Congress was not being racist by passing these laws. They actually thought that's what they were, that they thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were doing the right thing. In fact, black people signed on to these laws. And so that's not an issue. Congress was not being racist. So this law itself is not racist. So as we think about the enforcement of the law, yes, racial discrimination was going on with the enforcement of the law. Law enforcement officials were placing their law enforcement resources in almost exclusive black communities. That's racial discrimination. And that was absolutely going on. And sometimes these things happen and people don't know that that's what they're doing. And they're not racist because they don't know. But when you bring it to their attention and they justify or they try to defend doing these sorts of laws, now that's racist. And that's what happened when this was brought to the attention of the Congress in 1996. It was brought to the attention of Bill Clinton in 1996. And they all refused to change the law, even though the U.S. Sentencing Commission said we should change the law. The U.S. Sentencing Commission, by the way, are the people, they are the people in the country who sets the penalties for crimes in the country. And that was the first time their recommendation was rejected. So if you think about like, what's a racist, what's racial discrimination, that's an example. Congress, Bill Clinton, that was an example of them being racist. And the enforcement of these laws were an example of racial discrimination. I know in this country we think we're so remedial when it comes to race. We think that the only racist people wear white sheets. That's 1957, 1960. Or if somebody says nigger, we think that's racist. No, that's not it. It's action. Okay, other things that happen. When we look at the chemical the structure of cocaine, for example, focus your attention on the left, that's powder cocaine. On your right, that's crack cocaine. The only difference is back to the left, you see the red circle. That's a hydrochloride group. That's a salt. That's the only difference between these two compounds. That hydrochloride group does not contribute to the biological activity of cocaine. It's there only to keep the cocaine base stable, so you can't smoke it. That's the only reason that's the only real reason that it's there. But when you look at the pharmacological activity of the drug, it's all in the base. So when you smoke crack, you get the same effect, same intensity of effects if you shoot powder cocaine dissolved in water. Same drug, exactly the same drug. So all of this sort of information are data. These are the sort of data that was ignored as we think about why we punish crack cocaine so harshly than powder cocaine. So it would be, if you will, think about this. How many of you all smoke marijuana? I'm joking. I'm joking. You all was like, boy, I know I'm not in California. You all ready for medical marijuana here? I know it's on the ballot, but from this response, I don't know if you all ready. It's on the ballot in November, right?
We know it's there.
Yeah. All right, right on. It would be, the way we handled the crack powder thing, it would be like punishing people who smoke marijuana 100 times more harshly than those who chew it and eat it in a brownie. That would be the equivalent. It's ridiculous. It doesn't make sense. And that's what we have going on here. Other things that sort of challenged my thinking about this whole crack cocaine thing was, step back with me, if you will, to when I was an undergraduate. When I was an undergraduate, one of the things that I learned, one of the sort of core lessons that I learned about drugs was that if you allow an animal to self-administer, intravenously self-administer a drug like cocaine or methamphetamine, you allow them to press a lever to receive intravenous injections, they would do so until they died. That's what would happen. But the thing that you need to know about those experiments is that there was nothing else in the cage with the animal but the lever. So that's the only thing they had to do. Now, if you place toys, sweet treats, a sexually receptive mate in the cage with the animal would not self-administer drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine until death. In fact, they would engage in those other activities more so under most of the conditions. So that got me thinking, and other folks thinking, about would this sort of thing work with crack cocaine addicts? And by the way, my use of the word addict, I only use that word to make contact with the general public. I mean the definition of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, what we use in psychiatry, psychology, to diagnose someone if they have a substance use disorder. That's what I mean. So people who have this sort of disorder, crack cocaine disorder, what generally is called crack cocaine addict, we thought if we brought those people in the lab and asked them to choose between a hit of crack cocaine, a nice hit of crack cocaine, and some sort of alternative, would they behave in the same way those animals behave? Or would they behave in the caricature way that we see them portrayed in movies, in the popular press, in that they would only respond to another hit of cocaine? What we found was these folks responded like the rats, in that we offered them a small amount of money, $5 or a hit of cocaine, crack cocaine, that's worth a little more than $5. About half of the opportunities, they chose to take the drug, and about the other half of the opportunities, they chose to take the money. So again, it shows that even a small amount of money, as little as $5, could shift choice away from the crack cocaine. Shows that crack cocaine, the behavior of crack cocaine addicts, was responding in a normal sort of fashion. That behavior was being controlled by the same mechanisms of other behaviors. Other things that challenged my thinking was when I thought about who was the typical crack cocaine user. I thought it was some urbanite person, young urbanite person on a rampage. That's who I thought the typical user was. Turns out, this is the typical user. Some of you all know that this is Rob Ford, the mayor of Toronto. And this is the typical crack cocaine user, white male, employed, responsible, takes care of his family, pays his taxes, and so forth. This is the typical crack cocaine user. This is, in fact, the typical drug user. People who are responsible, take care of their business, take care of their family, and in some cases, they even become president of the United States. Some of you all know that the president, of course, used cocaine, marijuana, and the president before him used marijuana, widely suspected of using cocaine. President before him used marijuana. Not to besmirch those guys' reputation. That's not the goal here. The point is to show that the typical drug user are those guys who are responsible, those people who are pillars of their communities, those people who go to work, take care of their families. So when I started to find out all of this sort of stuff, it was challenging my thinking. But let's fast forward to now. When we think about what's happening now with methamphetamine, some of you guys know the show Breaking Bad? All right, meth. You guys know meth mouth and that sort of thing, right? Right on. So methamphetamine, that's the new sort of devil drug, the evil drug. It's considered so awful and so bad that in 2006, November 30th, George Bush had to proclaim that day as Methamphetamine Awareness Day. So whenever we have these sorts of problems, we have these presidential proclamations to let us know that we need to be aware of these problems. And also, when you see these presidential proclamations, it also should be red flag, a place for counterintuitive thinking. Okay? As we think about the counterintuitive thinking for methamphetamine, this is a picture of a brain slide, a brain imaging slide. Focus your attention on the left. That's what we would consider a normal brain, someone who doesn't use drugs or methamphetamine, this drug. On the right is someone who has used methamphetamine or has abused the drug for some years or so. And some researchers will sometimes put up these slides and ask you, the audience, to see the difference. And then you say, yeah, we can see the difference. One of them is more red, more bright, right? And then you think that you have data. That's not data. This is not data. This is just a pretty picture. But people think that this tells them something about the way these people might behave. It doesn't. Now, we can do brain images of this side of the room and compare it to this side of the room, and we can find some differences. But if the differences are such that this side of the room scans light up a little less, I don't think we want to call these people over here cognitively impaired, for example, would we? For example, if we do this with men and women, we see differences. There are areas in the brain where men have larger sort of processing activity than women. But we don't say that women are cognitively impaired as a result. Well, most of us don't say that as a result, right? But that's what the scientific literature has done. It was so maddening as I went through and actually looked at the data that I wrote a review, a critical review, where I reviewed all the literature in this area with methamphetamine abusers who had a battery of cognitive tasks and who have had these brain imaging. And then what I concluded in this paper was that the drug researchers in this area wildly exaggerated their findings. The bottom line here is that what they found didn't match what they said in the conclusions. They started with methamphetamine was bad. They found that methamphetamine, there was no difference really, but they said that it was bad. Started with it's bad, found nothing, said it was bad. That's in general. That's what the literature said. And this paper was published in 2012 in Neuropsychopharmacology. You can check it out. It's a critical review of that literature. Now, so one of the things that what it tells you is that if you read the scientific literature, it's critically important to read the methods and the results. Not so much the introduction, not so much the discussion, not so much the summary. Most people simply read the summary, and they get the story from the summary. And that's the problem, because when you look at the methods and the results, they oftentimes do not match. Okay? And so as we think about methamphetamine, as I've been looking at methamphetamine for the past several years, I thought it would be interesting to do the same study that we did with the crack cocaine users when we offered them alternatives to see if the methamphetamine users would respond like the crack cocaine users. Because now people are saying methamphetamine is more addictive than any drug that we've ever seen. And so we offered these methamphetamine users a hit of their drug, a nice dose, versus nothing. And that's what this slide here shows. And I'll show you this slide. Oh, it doesn't. Okay, the slides don't come up. That's okay. I'll explain to you. So when we offered them a hit of their drug 10 times, a hit of their drug, a nice dose of methamphetamine, versus nothing. They had 10 opportunities to take drug or nothing. What do you all think they took? Of course, you take the drug. Now, we offered them a hit of their drugs 10 times or $5. What do you guys think happened? They took what? 50-50. Took the money on about half of the occasions and drug on about half of the occasion. Then we increased the amount of money to $20. What do you think happened? They always took the money, right? They never took the drug, they always took the money. Again, evidence that these drugs, that these folks were responding in a normal way. Same sort of principles that guide our behavior guide their behavior. Same sort of principles. Okay. All right. So the question for me, one of the questions that I've been trying to think about lately and also in the book was, if we have all of this information, all of this evidence appearing to be inconsistent with what we teach about drugs, what we do with drug policy, the question for me is like, how and why do we do this if it goes against the empirical evidence, goes against what we actually find in science? Why do we continue to do this? Well, one of the ways that I tried to answer this or try to think about this is I tried to read people who I admire. What I have been describing here basically is considered the war on drugs. And that's kind of like the war of our day, if you will. That's just one of the multiple wars of our day. Martin Luther King had a struggle as well with the war of his day. The war of his day was the Vietnam War. And so I went and tried to read what he had said about that war and how he was struggling with this. He, of course, thought it was an unjust, evil, and futile war. And he also said that in international conflicts, the truth is hard to come by because most nations are deceived about themselves. Rationalizations and the incessant search for scapegoats are the psychological cataracts that blind us to our sins. And so this was helpful for me to kind of contextualize what was going on in terms of our treatment, our approach to drugs. And so as I think about how do we do it, I recently wrote a piece in The Nation to kind of think about how this was happening. And this piece was called How the Myth of the Negro Cocaine Fiend Helped Shape American Drug Policy. In 1914, 100 years ago today, or not today, but right around this time, we passed the first federal drug laws, the first laws to control drugs like opium, other opioids, and cocaine. Those were the first federal drug laws, and they were difficult to pass. In fact, we tried to pass these laws in 1909, and we tried to pass these laws in part to get favors, trade favors from China. There's a whole backstory for that. I won't go into it, but that was one of the major reasons we were trying to pass these laws. But in 1909, the country was not in any mood to have the federal government tell the states what to do with some federal policy. So that it wasn't happening. They took seriously the states' rights sort of thing. And then by 1914, we had a barrage of newspaper articles and accounts and testimonies in Congress talking about the Negro cocaine fiend. Because the original sort of federal laws didn't have cocaine in it. That was not included. So we included cocaine because we had now this new convenient scapegoat, the Negro cocaine fiend, and then that helped these laws to be passed. And so when you have these sort of convenient scapegoats or these vilified groups attached with the use of certain drugs, it's easier to pass laws to restrict those drugs. Because when you pass laws to restrict those drugs, you can actually go after the people we don't like in a society. And then we don't have to say we're going after those people. Instead, we're going after those drugs. It happened with crack cocaine. It's happening with methamphetamine. With methamphetamine, however, the population is different. The people who we don't like with methamphetamine are poor white people and gay people. That's who methamphetamine use is associated with. And so as long as you have the drug use being almost exclusively associated with a despised group, you can have repressive, restrictive laws that are inconsistent with evidence. So you can go after those folks without actually saying you're going after these folks. And so you say, well, why would anybody do that sort of thing? Well, there are benefits to that sort of thing. And the benefits are this. When you go after, say, a drug, like crack cocaine, for example, like I thought the problems that plagued my community was crack cocaine. Never mind unemployment was out of control. Never mind there was poor education. Never mind there were all kinds of other problems that plagued those communities. So when you go after drugs, you don't have to deal with the larger, more complicated problems. You can just go after the drugs. And also, another sort of reason that this thing goes on is that it's very profitable for law enforcement agencies. Every year, we spend $26 billion a year, taxpayers' money, on controlling drugs. 70% of that or so goes to law enforcement. But law enforcement aren't the only people who benefit, because in many cases, you go to jail or you go to treatment. Treatment providers also benefit from this. Scientists benefit. I benefit from this. My PhD was paid for because I was focused on studying drugs. I wrote something about, for my proposal, something about how I was going to solve this drug addiction problem. Politicians benefit because they don't really have to focus on what the real issues are. They can just give money to law enforcement, treatment providers, and scientists, and they appear to be dealing with the problem. This was a cartoon that was done in the 1960s. It was really for the Vietnam War, but my son modified it. This is President Johnson, of course, but it could be any president. And on his right arm, you see the one with the drug war. This is his sort of fancy at the moment, the drug war. And he's pointing his finger at urban needs. And this capsulizes what happens and what I've been talking about. So, as we come almost to the end, we have to think about the scapegoats. That didn't show up well. All right, that's fine. We've kind of talked about the scapegoat. So as we think about learning to think critically or counterintuitively, thinking about this, the thing is that we should remember is that if you want to think in a counterintuitive way, you can't be an idiot. This is not for idiots. You have to actually know how to think, and you have to also be unafraid to go where the data says. And you also have to be able to be alone, because it's lonely telling people that what we do, mostly what we're doing, for example, in this area, is wrong. So don't be afraid to be alone. Don't be a follower. And be courageous. That's what it requires. Also, be an outsider. You know, like if you look at me, I have looked like this for 47 years. I've been an outsider. There aren't many people in neuroscience who look like me. But it has given me a unique perspective, a perspective that allows me to look at things from a wide range of angles. And you all, if you want to be able to think counterintuitively, you have to perspective take. Put yourself in other people's position, not in some superficial way. I mean, really think about it. Learn about these sort of things. Be an outsider, and be proud to be an outsider, because if you do, there are some magical things that can happen. And always let the data dictate your position. Let the data dictate your position. If you let the data dictate your position, you don't have to worry about somebody who is more charismatic, who is a better public speaker, who is more religious, who is more anything. If you let the data dictate your position, you will be right. But you have to also remember that anecdote is not data. People sometimes get that twisted. Anecdote is important to tell a story so people remember the story. Anecdote is important for people to connect with your story, but anecdote is not a substitute for data. And that's critically important to remember. So as I leave you all tonight, and as I leave you all thinking about this sort of issue of counterintuitive thinking, how you can make your mark, as you think about making your mark, there are all kinds of things around us in our society that is going on where you can make your mark. You can write this perfect op-ed that you get published in the Miami Herald. Does people read the Miami Herald? Do they read? Or the New York Times, whatever they read here. There are all kinds of things that's happening in our society. Today, one of the big things that has happened earlier this year was the president announced the Brothers Keepers Initiative. And in January 2014, this year, he had a presidential proclamation. Now, presidential proclamations, right? Flag, flag, you all know that that's a place where you can get in and do some counterintuitive thinking. And he talked, and this proclamation talks about mentoring. And my problem with mentoring, this focus on mentoring, not to say that mentoring isn't important, but for these sort of black men and boys that we're talking about, it's really basic. Make sure they have jobs, make sure they have opportunities. This whole mentoring thing, this is more of a distraction. And so as the country talks more about mentoring, we're going down the wrong path. So you all can think about what you want to write about this, because this is too superficial and way too short. And I'll leave you all on that note, and let's have some questions. Thank you all. Please.
Questions, if you'd like to raise your hand, I'll just get to you with the microphone. Here you go, sir.
Thank you. I'm going to be a little bit of the devil's advocate here. You talked about the two instances where you were the people in the rooms with cocaine and the methamphetamine, and you did the experiment, and might want to call them anecdotes.
What? Experiment antidote?
Anecdotal evidence of behavior is what I'm trying to say.
What is anecdote? Are you calling my experiments anecdote?
Well, I'm making a joke.
Oh, because I'm like, that's insulting.
Okay.
Because these are scientific papers.
No, my question is, we believe, and maybe this is wrong, that people can become addicted to cocaine and methamphetamine. Your experiments and your data that you showed says that apparently that's not the case, that people given choices will make normal choices versus addictive choices. And based on those experiments that you carried out, can you please comment on that?
No, that's, what you point out is that I did a poor job. The goal of those experiments was not to, first of all, those people were addicts. So that's not even an issue. They were addicts. And the point is not that cocaine or methamphetamine is not addictive, because they are. Let's say 10 to 20% of the people who take those drugs will become addicts. We know that. We know this from tons of data. So it's certainly potentially addictive. That's not the point. The point there was that even when people are addicts, you can shift their behaviors to other behaviors. That's the point. That addiction doesn't mean that you only respond to your drug of choice. That was the point there. But the fact that these drugs are potentially addictive, that is absolutely, they are. They are potentially addictive. But it's important to remember also that the vast majority of people who use those drugs, even crack cocaine, are not addicts. So only a small percentage of the people who use them become addicts. But that's inconsistent from what they tell us or what you see in your movies, what people write about in the papers, and that sort of thing.
Thank you. I knew you were going to...
Next question. Here you go, Miss.
Hi, thank you. In referring to those same experiments, can I ask a methodological question? You're taking addicts and you're offering them ethically. How do you work it out? Where you're offering them a hit of an illegal illicit drug or money?
Yep.
So you actually were administering an illegal illicit drug to
That's right.
to your sample.
That's right.
And how did you get that past an IRB?
Right on. All right. So that's your question, because I just want to make sure you get your question out.
Yeah.
So the question is, we were administering an illegal drug.
What is IRB? Can you explain?
Thank you. So the IRB is the Institutional Review Board. They review studies that happen at an institution. They're looking to make sure that the studies are ethical and that they protect human subjects. That's the goal of the IRB. Now, your question is, how do you get such studies passed by an IRB? So you get studies passed by an RFB if you have the proper safety nets in place, right? So you are starting with the assumption, for example, that these drugs are so dangerous that you cannot administer them in a lab. Let's take methamphetamine, for example. Have you heard of Adderall, that drug?
Yeah.
Adderall and methamphetamine are the same drug, but the population doesn't know it. We prescribe Adderall for attention deficit disorder, obesity. We prescribe other amphetamines even for depression and those sorts of things. Same drug. The public doesn't know it. So these drugs are already being used. In fact, when we administer these drugs, they're being administered under much more safe settings than what people on the outside are doing. And cocaine, of course, is FDA approved for various types of surgeries. We use that drug in surgery. Cocaine, of course, without cocaine, we don't have Novocaine, we don't have some of the other sort of local anesthetics that we have. So these drugs are not as dangerous as we've been told that they are. Not to say that people should go out and use these drugs without any education and that sort of thing, but we certainly give these drugs in medical settings all the time.
Sir, you had a question here in the front row. Let me give you.
I'm interested in you specifically. You were born into this kind of environment that you're studying. How did you get out of it? You kind of alluded it in your presentation in your mindset, but I'd like to hear from you how you felt and what you did.
So the question is, how did I become me? Well, I wrote a whole book to explain that. And it's on sale here at Books and Books. That's a complicated question. I mean, how I became me is that I had a number of people who kind of invested in me. Some of the skills that I learned in terms of skills that were in the underground economy, let's say, illegal market, actually translated into mainstream. I was an athlete. I played basketball throughout high school. I played basketball in the Air Force. All of those sorts of things allowed me to make contact with education. And when I couldn't do basketball as much, education became more and more important. And so there were people in my life who pushed me. There were athletics. And for my PhD, the only place that took me for PhD in neuroscience was Wyoming, the whitest state in the union, and me. And so I went, so there were a wide range of sort of decisions that I made. But one of the most important things that happened was when I was in the Air Force, I spent all 4 years outside of the country. If I would have stayed in the country, the number that this country does on black boys and men is remarkable. So being in England allowed me to develop self-confidence and all the rest of those things that I don't know if it would have happened in this country.
Thank you.
Over here, okay.
Hi, Dr. Hart. First of all, thank you for coming out and doing this presentation, very informative. Going back to that experiment that you did, I hate to harp on it, but I'm thinking from an addict's point of view, if you're going to offer them $5 versus a hit, just about a zero sum. But if you give them $20, they'll take the $20 and get 5 hits, and that's
right on
the way to go.
Right on. No, that's beautiful. No, that's thank you for raising that question. I mean, that's a great one because they were in the hospital for about two to 4 weeks in some of these experiments. So you save up your money and you say, well, I would rather go get high outside of the lab, and I have more money to go do that. Some of them may have done that, but one of the things that's required for them to do it is that they have to have what we call long-term planning. They have to be able to inhibit certain sort of behaviors. All of these things we said they couldn't do, and they displayed them if they did what you suggested. Maybe some did that. Others did not. Others saved their money, for example, to pay bills because we wrote checks for various sort of their electric bills or these sorts of things that they had to pay. But that's a great question, and some may have done that. But even still, they are autonomous adults who earned their money, and they can do with it what they will. Yeah, it's a great point.
Another question back here. Folks, after this, I think after this lady, I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Good evening.
Hi.
First, I'm a little bit confused. Okay, you said that the major drug addicts in this country are white males that are employed.
Drug users.
Drug users are
Yep.
employed.
Yep.
Okay, so the incentive for them, I mean, they have everything already. They've got the jobs, they've got the cars.
Yep.
So why are they using?
Wait. No, so you're asking, I think, so you're asking why do people who have jobs and so forth use drugs?
Right.
Do you drink alcohol?
I don't.
Does anybody here drink alcohol? Why do you all drink alcohol? You all employed, right? You drink alcohol, for example, like I drink alcohol periodically. I have to go to a lot of boring ass events. And so there is some alcohol there sometimes, and alcohol is a really good anxiety reliever. And you can tolerate people a little better. So people may drink alcohol for that reason. And people may do cocaine for that reason. They may do methamphetamine for that reason. They do it to enhance social interactions. That's probably one reason that people do all of these drugs. And other people do them for other reasons. So the fact that people do drugs, that's not why they do drugs. That's not even really interesting. When we think about why people do alcohol, we kind of know enhancing some sort of social functioning. But then let's just think about your question even further. What about those people, for example, who have jobs and they're drug addicts? They have all of these alternatives and they become drug addicts. We can think about athletes, we can think about actors, we can think about people who have a lot of resources and they still become addicts, right? Let's think about it from that perspective. We think about that, it's like, well, why do they become addicts? Well, I don't want to leave people here tonight with the impression that people become addicted to drugs simply because they have a lack of alternative reinforcers or a lack of options. That's not it. That's for some people. For other people, they become addicted for a variety of reasons, ranging from co-occurring psychiatric illnesses, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, wide range of issues. Other people become addicts because they, for example, when we think about drug addiction, it's really about, or using drugs, it's really about tempering your behavior. Some people just haven't learned the skills to temper their behavior in multiple domains because they may not have had to, because they have somebody taking care of all of their businesses for them. And if they no longer have that, or it's not as good as it used to be, maybe that's why they become addicted. But addiction is a complicated thing, and people become addicted for a variety of reasons. And the most important thing when we think about addiction is that people have to first have a really good assessment. And that oftentimes doesn't happen. So when you have a really good assessment, you figure out why that person before you is addicted. And one shoe doesn't fit all.
Okay, and just one other question. Where did you grow up at in Miami?
Carroll City.
I think there was a hand down here.
That was a good segue, because I actually wanted to ask you a kind of open-ended question about Miami. And what is your relationship with Miami now? How do you view it? How do you look back on your time here? Do you think that the city has advanced since you grew up here? And
So I left Miami 30 years ago. I rarely come to Miami. The last 3 times I've come to Miami has been at the invitation of Mitch. So that might say something about my feelings about Miami. I live in New York, and I love New York. I love New York in part because we have all of these crazy people from everywhere, and we have a subway that make us interact with each other. And if you don't like some group for whatever reason, but you want that seat on the subway, you deal with it. And that forces us to interact. When I come to places like Miami and everybody is in their car and they're going out to their burbs and their various sort of communities, they don't have to interact. I don't choose to live like that. That's not a life that I want to live like.
Yes, Dr. Hart. Am I on? Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for your information. I'd like to ask you a question about your interpretation of the exact disease of addiction. Now, I'm a person that you were talking about because I was a crack addict from my 33rd birthday in November of 1985 to September 27th, 1987. Almost 22 months, hardcore. And prior to that, I was addicted, quote unquote, to Quaaludes. Like if you watched Wolf of Wall Street, that was a carbon copy of me, his attitude. Now,
not many people knew Quaaludes, until that movie just
yeah. I'm from the 60s and 70s.
L17.
So, yeah.
Is it
But
L714s?
anyway,
Yeah.
Roar, 747s, lemons, peppers,
Right
400s,
on.
Anyway, my question is this, and by the way, I've been clean and sober since September 24th, 1987.
You don't have to use that here as a badge, man. That's one of my pet
I'm
peeves.
just saying that, I mean, but the thing is, when I was taking that first hit of the day, I spent the rest of the day chasing it, and nothing else mattered. But if I couldn't get it and I went to sleep, I woke up and I didn't have the craving. Same thing with Quaaludes, same thing with any narcotics. So I didn't consider myself an addict that my body had to have it. I never believed that cocaine was an addiction that you had to have. It was just, I don't know how to clinically explain it, and this is what I want you to explain to me. But what I did find in my life of addiction, the one thing that I had to have was cigarettes. And I quit that cold turkey. And that was the thing that my body could not, I would do anything if I couldn't get a cigarette during the period of time I was smoking. So I'm just trying to, if I could get an answer from you, because what levels of you think, or what you explain as addiction versus situational addiction, temporary, etc.
Yes, thank you.
My
What
pleasure.
you just illustrated is one of the things that people like me hate to answer in public. So like, my man, you just told me, he was like, give me some personal therapy right here in front of everybody. I need to know a lot more information about your situation before I could pinpoint what's going on. But what I will say is this: when we think about addiction, so addiction now the DSM has 11 sort of criteria, and the criteria, some of them are physical, but physical being like tolerance, withdrawal syndromes, but they're not necessary. But they could be there, but they're not required. The major thing with addiction in terms of having somebody meet criteria for addiction is having this disruption in social functioning in terms of, are you meeting your obligations at work? Are you meeting your obligations in the family, education, all those sorts of things? Are you using the drug and putting yourself in harm's way, like intoxicated and driving? Or are you, have you had several unsuccessful attempts to quit or cut down your use? Are you spending most of your time, most of the day engaged in getting the activity, getting the drug, or recovering from the drug? All of these sort of things. So you have to meet a certain number of these criteria. Doesn't matter what the drug is. And so nicotine addiction may look different for some people, from one person to the next. Cocaine addiction, same sort of thing. So it's a hard question that you asked me without knowing some real personal stuff. And
Well, it's meaningless now, because I don't have it. It's just a thought.
yeah.
It's curious.
Yeah, but by the same token, too, you have to think about, you said you were 33. Now I suspect you're about 40?
37.
Yeah, all right.
Going
But
to 62, and I write about it a lot.
yeah. So now I know you could probably you can do crack cocaine now and not have the same sort of issues because you're older and you're not the same. But you see this.
I'm addicted to exercise.
But you see, this is what will happen if we're gonna really do this therapy thing.
Thank you. Thank you
I
very
got
much.
a question relating to that. I've been around a lot of people that have done drugs, and the hardest thing for them to quit, all of them, I don't care what they were on, is cigarettes.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, from my personal experience, that cigarettes are the most addictive of anything out there.
Yep. So when we think about that, there have been a number of studies that have been conducted, and we say, what's the percentage of people who use alcohol will become addicted? About 15%. What's the percentage of people who use tobacco will become addicted? A third, 33%. Cocaine, about 20%. Heroin, about 25%. Marijuana, about 10%. So you can see that tobacco clearly is the most addictive of those drugs. In terms of, if we look at the numbers of people who will become addicted to that drug versus other drugs. Absolutely.
Carl, I have a quick question for you. And I want to go back to your discussion about stereotypes and, going back to the newspaper you showed from the turn of the century and that sort of thing. It seems like we haven't come very far from those stereotypes. If you look just at popular media and popular culture. I mean, a program that I watched was Boardwalk Empire, for instance. And if you watch that, it resonates now much differently after hearing you speak about it in terms of how that perpetuates these kinds of stereotypes that were found back then. You're a voice, you're kind of a lone voice in terms of talking about this. You've done an incredibly effective job. I've seen you on talk shows, numerous talk shows, and you're constantly wowing whoever you're talking to about it. But how do we make inroads into changing this kind of stereotype so that we can change laws, change who ends up in prison, which are the essential things that arise because of these stereotypes?
Yeah, so one of the ways that we change laws, really, the most effective ways to change laws is to make sure that the people who are making the laws have loved ones who are impacted by the laws that we think are wrong. If that's not happening, good luck. And so one of the things I think about what I'm trying to do, really, I have really given up on the people in Washington, the lawmakers. I'm really trying to make sure that these ideas are here for young people. So when they grow up, these ideas are not new to them. They will have learned this. Because the information that I'm talking about and teaching now, for people who came along in this is your brain on drugs era, just say no era, that means that they have to learn something new. And whenever you're teaching people something new that conflicts with something that they think they already know, that's difficult. Because it's like, you mean to tell me I put in this work to learn that this is your brain on drugs, and now you're telling me that that's not right? Get out of here. You know? And so I am simply trying to make sure I have this information out here for the younger generation. And then I'm more hopeful about what they will do. But until people are infected, their loved ones, not going to happen.
Right, question here in the second row. Here.
Just curious, thank you, that was a great answer. Also about the random sample that you used, like how random was it, what was the representation, so that it kind of falls into that, it's a broad spectrum, not an isolated population or community.
So when I think about our studies, for example, the crack studies, the crack cocaine studies, the people who respond to these studies, by the way, we pay them about $70 a day to do these studies. And so the people who respond to the crack cocaine studies are primarily black males. They do so because the crack cocaine has been so vilified. People are afraid to say that they were crack cocaine users for fear of being ostracized. And then in New York City, in some places, the unemployment rate for black men is 50%. And so this is a way for them to earn money. But when you look at the methamphetamine studies, that's a different representation. You have a lot of white men, you have some women too, and then you look at the heroin studies in New York City, they're almost exclusively white men. So it all depends what the drug is, but it still raises the issue that you're raising about representation. We still, in these laboratory studies where we give drugs, we still have a substantially lower number of women who participate in these studies, because these studies kind of require that people drop out of their lives for about 2 to 3 weeks. And sometimes women have child care responsibilities, and they are less likely to be irresponsible than their male counterparts. So it's more difficult.
Question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I'm a high school teacher, so I have a practical question for you. Given the seductiveness of drugs and the legal realities, I have kids who go every year to Ultra, and I know what they're going to be doing there. So, you know, I want them to come back, and you know, sometimes they almost don't. So what should my message be to them, or people's messages be to their kids?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, now you're asking questions for the next book. But that's a good question. It's simple. If you're a high school teacher, one of the things that you want to know is what's the drug that they're more likely to be using? No, it's marijuana. Marijuana. Marijuana is by far the drug that people were more likely to use. Some will use some Molly, ecstasy, but not as much. Marijuana and alcohol, those are the major drugs that they're going to be using. And so when you think about the effects of marijuana, I would really just kind of focus with marijuana mainly. One of the things that we have lied to children about in terms of drugs, they get messages that you use these drugs and you will change your life forever. So if you have a bad reaction, and sometimes you do because it's important, the setting is critically important for drug effects. And if you're taking drugs in an anxiety-provoking environment, particularly a drug like marijuana, you can have an anxiety attack. You can get really paranoid. That can happen. So you prepare the kids for these kinds of things. You prepare them to let them know that it's going to be okay. It's going to wear off. You're going to be fine. Because one of the things that happens is that in a panic, that just makes it even worse. So you want to make sure that the kids understand that these drug effects are rate limiting, the drugs that they're using. You want to make sure that they're starting off with smaller doses if they're taking the drug. If you're a novice at this, don't smoke a whole cigarette by yourself. Don't try to show that you're tougher than anyone else if you're a novice. All of these common sense sort of things is what you want to tell people. And you want to also make sure people understand that if they're using drugs, that they should use with people who has more experience than them. So those are some practical sort of things. Like my kids, I have a 13-year-old, I have a 19-year-old. They get this education, this kind of education. They get a wide range of education. But my goal is to make sure that they live another day and not to chastise them for engaging in some behavior. We do the same thing with driving, same thing with sex, all of these sorts of things.
Question down here. Let me just get the microphone to you, sir.
What are the different variations of legalizing it, and what do you think the impact will be, especially as it comes to Florida, around the world, in the United States, and particularly here?
You say legalizing it. What is it?
Marijuana and other drugs for medical use and not medical use, and all kinds of combinations from around the world, particularly in California and in the U.S., and coming up to Miami. Florida.
All right, we'll start with marijuana. So medical marijuana is legal in 23 states. And the only southern state is Maryland. That's the only southern state. So Florida is trying to become the first southern state to legalize medical marijuana. I think that medical marijuana legalization, it's happening. The fact that marijuana is useful for some medical conditions, that's a fact. There's scientific evidence for that. It's not the best medication for all of these things that it's being suggested for. But that's the same thing with something like aspirin. Aspirin for some people is not the best medication for a headache. Ibuprofen might be, or acetaminophen might be. So we have a wide range of medications for a variety of illnesses. And so medical marijuana is, I think that train has left the station. But as we think about legalizing marijuana for recreational purposes, only 2 states have done that, Colorado and Washington. And Colorado was the first to be up and running, and they initially reported a lot of tax revenue. They generated a lot of tax revenue as a result of this. That will be the determining factor in terms of what other states will do. If Colorado continues to report considerable tax revenues, you will see it spread. Because ultimately, this is the ultimate capitalist society.
what are the disadvantages? You said some advantages, obviously. What
What
are
are
the
the disadvantages?
disadvantages, and what is the balance?
Yeah.
What is the cost-benefit analysis here?
That's a great question. So the question becomes, what's the cost-benefit analysis? So one of the things that many researchers talk about is that the fact is marijuana is just like any other psychoactive drug. Psychoactive drugs are potentially dangerous. That's a fact. If we think about anything from alcohol to caffeine, all of these things can be potentially dangerous if taken in too larger doses. So the question becomes, do you want to introduce into society another potentially dangerous drug? That's the question. And so you balance that with the other side. What are our current approach? What are the negatives of our current approach? Every year we arrest 700,000 people for marijuana arrests, and 80% of those are for possession. Vast majority are for simple possession. And then when you start looking at the racial disparity across the country, black people, for example, are 2 to 8 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than their white counterpart, even though they don't use the drug more so. And you look at places like New York City, 80–90% of the people arrested in New York City for marijuana, black and Latino. And so you see how these things are being played out in certain communities. And so if you care about social justice, that's a huge sort of consideration in terms of changing how we're currently regulating the drug.
That is another benefit.
That's right. That's another benefit. But the potential harms is just like any other drug.
And when you add all the benefits, would the tax advantage be enough to fund all the problems that it creates and remain and exceed it so that the benefit will exceed, and plus the social together, it seems like there will be a huge net benefit.
Yeah, that's right. But you know, you're asking a tough question. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can tell you this. If you think about, we know how to keep people safe with drugs. We know how to do that with alcohol, and we do. For example, there are people, alcohol, if we think about all of these drugs we're talking about, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, alcohol, of all of those drugs, the only one that people can die from, like a withdrawal syndrome, is alcohol. That's the only one. You can't die from heroin withdrawal, can't die from cocaine withdrawal, or any of those sorts of things. So alcohol is a potentially really toxic drug. But we know how to keep people safe. We make sure that we have certain concentrations of alcohol in each bottle and at dosing. We can do the same thing with marijuana. But what we have to do first is be honest. And that's going to be a radical shift because we're not honest about drugs in this country. But if we really want to keep people safe, we know how to do it. I certainly know how to do it.
Folks, 2 more questions if you'd like to raise your hand. Is there someone who hasn't spoken yet? No? All right. Okay, I didn't mean that bad. You and then this gentleman in the back row. Here you go.
Just in reference again to the arrests, can you speak to the Fair Sentencing Act and if we have any data on that? I haven't had a chance to look myself.
Do you have your computer on you?
No.
I'm joking. You just said the Fair Sentencing Act. I have been doing this for a year, and nobody's ever asked me about the Fair Sentencing Act. That's pretty damn good. The Fair Sentencing Act, I will. The Fair Sentencing Act was signed August 3rd, 2010. President Obama, he decreased the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Remember the 100 to 1 that I said? It went from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. And so that has happened. But when we look at the people who are still being arrested under those laws, the racial disparity remains. And then when you look at 18 to 1 versus 1 to 1, it still doesn't make any sense because they're the same drug. It's still ridiculous. But people acted as if that was some huge victory. Yeah, that one there upsets me a bit.
Yeah, Dr. Hart, this is a very similar question, and it has to do with what happens after the thousands and thousands of addicts get out of prison. Do you see opportunities that the prison system is missing in terms of breaking the habit? If they understand the myth, would they be doing some things different in terms of how they spend the times with addicts in prison? What's the data about repeat offenders? Is that related to this topic?
So I don't know if the people in jail most of them are addicts. I would predict that they're not. They may have gone to jail for a drug-related charge, but I don't know if they would be addicts. And then if we think about people in jail, this is not, we wouldn't say that this is the case for everyone, but a large proportion of people, you just want to make sure people are plugged into the society such that they have a stake in your society, that they want to protect the society, jobs, skills, all those sorts of things. I think that's where we should start at first. And if people have drug problems, we have to make sure we have a really good, careful assessment to make sure we treat what the real problems really are.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. I think we're going to leave it there tonight. Folks, yeah, sure. So folks, we have High Price for sale at the counter just through there. He's going to be signing over here at the table to the left of the screen. I'll ask you one more favor. If when you got up you folded your chair and stacked it against the wall, it would help us with the traffic in this room. And it's always fascinating when we have you in the store, sir. Please, Dr. Carl Hart, let's
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. How you doing?
It was a really great presentation.
Right.
Really good.
Right.